Thank you very much. Molweni.
Molweni.
Are there any people from the Eastern Cape in the audience? Bolam Kaya. Kumand balapa, ne? Nkosi cool. So, why are we standing here today? And I think we've had a fantastic intro. And I guess it really boils down to Sherry, actually. She's probably the biggest reason we're standing here today together. Why do I say this? Just a little bit about Crew. We're a 20-year-old financial planning practice based in Cape Town. And we started doing some very basic financial literacy or financial empowerment sessions. And we've done these through what we call our Crew Academy. And it's this work that Sherry and myself and the rest of the team have embarked on. And what we've discovered while doing this work is that we're missing something. And that's the real issue. We tend to focus on sort of the Western way of doing financial planning. And we really are missing a big trick when it comes to financial planning. We're not planning for the lives that black people live primarily, and that is something that we would like to address. So I thought it might be a good idea, although we've had a kind introduction and I've been forced to speak closer earlier than intended, just a little bit of background that you can see from the faded picture.
Let me say that.
Sherry and I are quite different. I don't know if anyone's noticed. I've got grey hair. Sherry's isn't grey. Sherry's beautiful. Sherry's intelligent. So there are a lot of differences. But there are also similarities. And I think it's these similarities that have brought us together. And where we are similar is in our upbringing. I was born on a farm on the Kaskama River near what is now known as Ekong. But Ekong used to be called King Williamstown, for those of you not aware of the name change just yet. And this land that we grew up on back in the late 60s, early 70s, was actually land that was colonized by the Cape Colony in the late 1800s, or in the 1800s. And we farmed this land for a number of years, and I had the privilege of growing up with a whole bunch of Xhosa friends. And that's where I learned to speak Xhosa as a young boy. And those were my friends. Those are the guys that I interacted with. And what we witnessed on the farm is how, and I didn't realize it at the time, but we realized how the system had been changed because of a number of factors, which I'm going to get into later. So just to give you the sort of end to this intro, this farm was later in the early 80s incorporated into the Ciskei. And yes, we were expropriated, but it was with compensation. So no hard feelings. No one needs to feel sorry for me. But the point is that was the background that I came from, and it resonated so much with me. Growing up as a young boy, we'd spend our time on the river fishing, besi bamba impalang, besi loba pa emlanjeni, and then my favorite food was mpokoko, and I love mngqosh to this day. So those are like memories of my childhood and just growing up and going up to fetch my black friends in their sort of what was a tribal hut back then, and going in and just witnessing that culture. And I just want Sherry just to share her background.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you so much, Tsungai, and thank you so much, everyone, for being here. So I am from a village called Goromonzi. I'm actually from Zimbabwe, and I come from a village called Goromonzi, which is about 40 kilometers away from Harare. But if you ask me, I'm from Harare, as most Zimbabweans are. And I go home quite often, and every time I go home, can you guys hear me? Yes. Okay. So every time I go home, I'm quite fascinated. I spend a lot of time in the village. I'm just fascinated by the wisdom that is in the village and how things are done. And every time I come back to work, I chat with Craig. As you can see, he's a village boy himself. He gets a bit nostalgic when I'm sharing what's going on, like in my village. But when we chatted, or when we chat, we realized that we actually had first-hand experience in just by growing up in these environments in the village, to see that, you know, Africans have always planned. And we had first-hand experience in seeing how Africans have always planned, saved, and invested for the future. And so also through our Crew Academy and the sessions that we do them in the communities, and it's majority Black Africans, we realized that the information that we wanted to give to our audience, or that we wanted to share with our audience, was very much, it was far from, there was a disconnect between the information we wanted to share with our audience, again, majority Black Africans, as financial planners, and the information that they were understanding and the information that they actually needed. And so today, that has brought us to our topic of, we realize now that there are gaps that exist between the current financial planning framework and what the Black African actually needs and understands as financial planning. So in our topic today, we're going to just make submissions. We're not proposing anything. We're not here to change anything. But we're inviting everyone in this room to start thinking deeper into what financial planning could be. And we just want to make a submission so that we find ways that we can come up with financial planning strategies that are culturally resonant and effective for everyone. So let's look at the history, first of all, of what financial planning has always been in Africa. So when we talk about financial planning, it's almost like it's a new concept to Africans, but the truth of the matter is that it's not. Africans have always, saved and planned for the future, and we look at land. The first sort of, they used land as a model or as a tool for financial planning. So land originally was collectively owned by communities, clans, and families rather than a single person. So back in the day, there would be a piece of land that would be owned by a village. But the planning aspect in that is that this land, those who know farming know just how difficult it is. But the communities had to plan around that land to make sure that the land is sustainable and they prosper. And we also have livestock. Livestock was also a form of wealth back in the day, where especially cattle were considered almost like a medium of exchange. And even to this day, cattle and livestock are still a symbol of wealth within the villages. And the planning aspect, and if you go to the villages today, I don't know how many of you are from certain villages, but if you go into the villages today, you can easily identify the families, the communities that looked after their wealth, be it their cattle. You can see today because they are more well up than others. So that is the planning aspect. Other families would choose to go through to feast through their cattle on Christmas. Others decided to save and let them breed so that they could have more cattle. So as simple as that is planning. It might not be financial planning as we know it today, but that's how originally Africans planned. And so this wealth was transferred through generations by three different ways. Number one, inheritance was a form of transferring wealth from one generation to the other. And of course, from a family, sons would be earmarked for inheritance, essentially speaking. And then there was marriage, where two families could come together and decide to marry their children to enlarge their territories. And then also succession planning. Succession planning is not a new concept in African financial planning. Back then in the communities, if you were a talented farmer, if you were a talented hunter, you'd be earmarked to take over when one of the elders passed on. So that's sort of like a historical perspective. And in this perspective, we're just shining the light on the fact that planning, especially in the African culture, is not a new concept. It's always happened. And of course, like, imagine in the world of social media, just with anything, there are always controversies around, methods and, the way people do things. And with African planning, that controversy, or it was not spared from controversies. Number one, the way Africans planned was deemed to contribute to gender inequality. So this is where the sons would have rights. Women would have access to land and to farming, but they didn't necessarily have the rights to the land. So that was seen to contribute to gender inequality. And then there was a problem with the lack of documentation, where if someone inherited something, there was a lack of tracing back to see who actually made this decision. So that lack of paperwork became a struggle for the modern day planning, right? And then there was another issue where the traditional methods of planning in the African context, it was seen to alienate vulnerable groups, because remember, the male dominated these families and these communities, and when the father figure passes, we have orphans and widows that are left without any rights to any land. They're left to work for other people. So that was one of the controversies. Those were the three controversies mainly around African financial planning. And so we find ourselves today in this age where there's a narrative that goes around to say Africans don't plan. We've seen articles, we've read the news, we're on social media, there's a narrative that says Africans live for the now. Africans don't plan. Most Black South Africans don't save. Most Black Africans don't save for the future. But we've just shown you now that that is simply not true, because planning has always happened in Africa. So we ask ourselves a question: how did we get here where there's a disconnect between our history and our present? And I'll let Craig chat more about what happened. Thanks, Craig.
So you see what she does to me. She gives me the colonial slide. I knew it was coming. So the reality is, in our minds, there are three major issues, and there are probably a whole lot more. We just really want to focus on these three issues. So what happened with colonialism is that the colonialists brought a new monetary system, a new way of trading, which was foreign. The other influence, major influence, was the sort of land grabs that happened. So, as we've spoken about earlier, a lot of the tribal lands were dispossessed by white farmers, and it kind of culminated in the 1913 Native Land Act, whereby black people were only allowed to own about 13% of the available land in South Africa. So those were three major influences, and I know there are many, many others, but if you just think about those three and the way traditional financial planning was done in these black communities, those all had a massive influence. But there were a couple of others. This slide, don't worry too much about the detail. What we're talking about here is how people migrated from the rural areas to the cities. And this is something that started many, many years ago. And one of the main contributors was that the work that was available in the cities. But because of apartheid, the families couldn't necessarily move to those cities. So you all grew up experiencing this. You've heard the stories from a mother, a father, or one of the like, where mom had to go and work in a city because she was given permission under the apartheid laws to work and live in a city. Dad worked on a mine. Okay, that was a very typical African story, which kind of changed when apartheid was ended, because what happened then was that it was a lot easier to move. But the problem is the damage kind of had been done to the family structures. So you guys, I'm like preaching to the converted. You lived it, you've seen it, you've experienced it. But I'm just highlighting that this rural-urban migration meant there was a change in the way that planning was done traditionally in these black cultures. The second or the third big influence was the AIDS pandemic. And we saw this reach its peak in the sort of early 2000s. And what this did, and I'm sure a number of you again in this room have lived through this. You've lost your mother and your father back then. You were the eldest child in the family, and you were expected to raise your siblings. If you were fortunate, you had grandparents who were still around, but they might not have had the financial means. So these are had major implications for the way that black people traditionally planned. So we now need to ask ourselves the question, and it's a difficult one because there are a lot of my colleagues in this room, and as a profession, the question is, what have we done to understand this very different background when it comes to putting these financial plans together? You know, the view is we believe that, and I'm including myself, I'm including our business, we believe we've been failing up to now, if I have to be brutally honest. We believe we've been failing. So why do I say this? Well, let's look at how we do financial planning. Let's look at what the textbook tells us are the life stages. And I'm not going to go through each and every one. I know I'll put you to sleep. But I just want to focus on a couple of issues. Let me call us white guys, Western sort of way of planning. There's a big focus on 21sts. There's a big focus on the wedding. And our biggest concern, you know, if I'm sitting here in this room, the only thing I'm really concerned about is when are my parents going to run out of money? Because, you know, they call us the sandwich generation. We want to make sure we've raised our kids before our parents need our support. And that's really the only major concern we have. And our planning is actually quite simple. It's very simple and straightforward. And I'm going to hand in to Sherry, and you'll see from the chart there's a whole lot more that comes into a black person's financial planning.
Yes, thank you, Craig.
Thanks.
So like Craig said, what we're trying to do with this slide is to show you the differences between what currently the financial planning framework is all about. So someone gets born, we save for education, they get married, maybe a divorce, and then retirement and death. But what we're saying today is that a black African person's life is not as straightforward as that. And this is what I'm going to show you today. So you get born, right? And before you go to varsity, before you start saving for education, you have to go through certain rites of passage. If you're a Xhosa person, who here is Xhosa? Ever heard of Umgidi? That must happen, right? It's a rite of passage where young boys turn into men. But in our financial planning concept, in the conversations that we have with clients, these topics are missing. We don't account for that. You go to varsity, you get education, some education. I won't call it black tax. I'll just say do something at home. You have to show appreciation to your parents. You have to, maybe renovate your mother's kitchen just to show that, you have been educated and you're grateful. And marriage is not just marriage. It's not a one sentence, one wedding, we go to court, we sign papers, it's done. I've lived through it. There's lobola, right? Aurora if you're Shona. And before you get to the traditional wedding part, as a lady, you have to be welcomed into the groom's family. We call it kuperekwa. If you're Zulu or Xhosa, it's called umembe. So you have to go to the groom's family, and it's another big event. It's a big welcoming event. It's another big financial event because you must buy certain things to take to the groom's family. And then there's the traditional wedding, and then there's the white wedding, right? And there are all these other steps, and we get to death. Death is not just you die, cremation happens. In planning, we put like 20,000, 30,000 rand death expense. But what we're saying is that in the African culture, it's more than that. You die, and there's a huge gathering that happens. There's a memorial service that happens. And a few months down the line, there has to be a tombstone unveiling that happens. Depending on which part of Africa you're from, there are certain other events that follow that death event. And this is what we're saying, to say the current financial planning model is not inclusive or is not including all these other steps, it's really just catering to a certain minority and a certain group of people. So this is essentially the grips of what we're saying, to say we have to do better as financial planners.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's back to me. Okay,
Yes.
Sherry, you can keep the...
Cool.
Yeah. So I think the question is, so what now? And the good news is we don't need to go designing new software and new tools and come up with like massive solutions. The solution's actually simple. It's staring at us. We need to understand black culture. As financial planners, we need to understand black culture and we need to plan for it. All the tools are there, as I've said. It's a very simple process. We need to be trained. We need to educate planners to ask the right questions. And I don't think that is happening. Certainly hasn't been happening in our business up to now. Take full responsibility for that. But this is a massive area in our view that we can improve the process so it becomes a lot more inclusive.
Thank you, Craig. And just on that previous slide, we almost thought perhaps we should include exactly how much each step costs. And then we thought about it. Financial planning is not about the amount. It's the why. It's the story. And we need to cater for, we need to speak to that. Our financial plans need to speak to people's full stories and not just part of what we think as planners is important. But we need to have plans that reflect people's cultures and that are just culturally resonant and effective for them. And just in conclusion, we underestimate the power of financial planning. And I think having a financial planner can be a powerful thing. And I think if we put some measures in place to sort of address the things that we've raised today, financial planning actually has the potential and the power to promote acceptance within our very diverse society. Financial planning also has the power to promote cultural preservation in a world where black people here will understand. We feel like, the new generation is doing things differently. But imagine having a plan that speaks to your cultural values, your child going through your plan one day and knowing exactly why you want them to go through umembeso, why you want them to go through certain cultural processes, and this is reflected in your financial plan. I think we have a powerful industry, and we can do so much more than we're currently doing, just to involve and to include everyone in what we do as financial planners. Thank you.
Thank you.